Today we are looking at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe from the series The Chronicles of Narnia. And we're going to look at all of the Easter eggs and little things that you may have missed and all of the wonderful things that point to the Christian religion. Today, joining me in this video is a little-known little dude by the name of Joshua Sternberg from the channel Theology with Josh. Now, Theology with Josh is an absolutely amazing channel, and he goes through all sorts of really cool religion and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien kind of stuff. You definitely should check him out. I brought him on today because this man has read C.S. Lewis. And no, I don't mean in the sense that we've all read C.S. Lewis. I mean he has read all of C.S. Lewis. And the biggest reveal of all is that he just so happens to be my brother. So without further ado, Theology with Josh. Josh, will you introduce yourself?
Hi guys, I'm Theology with Josh. I have 30,000 subscribers, but 29,000 of them came from posting Family Guy shorts. So I'm not actually, you know, any kind of a YouTuber out here. But yeah, I followed Gabriel out my mother about 2 years after.
Correct.
And then I got really into C.S. Lewis a couple of years back, and I read every book he published in his lifetime. So there's stuff that came out afterwards that made by like editors and stuff I haven't gotten to, but everything he published in his lifetime I've read, and so yeah, I'm pumped to talk about the friggin' Chronicles of Narnia.
This is going to be really awesome. And totally unscripted comment. I have this memory, and maybe it's a false memory. We'll talk about how we regard memories later on in the video. But I have this memory of reading to you a portion of The Last Battle several years ago, and I don't think you had read any C.S. Lewis or really gotten into it much at that point. Do you share that memory with me? Did that send you down a path at all, or am I self-aggrandizing myself too much?
No, I do remember it, and then I remember actually listening to the last battle years later and being like, "Oh, it's not Gabe's voice. It's kind of lame," you know. You know, like how mom read us books growing up and you hear mom's voice and you read it back is one of those things.
Yeah, yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, I am definitely a very lame older brother, as older brothers go. But let's get into this video. What I have on the screen is just kind of an overview of how C.S. Lewis treats his characters. They all have these sort of specific meanings to convey as we go through the broader series. And we're going to go through each one of these kind of one by one and tackle how this plays out. So first off the list is Aslan, the great lion, the sort of the main character in all of the books, and he famously represents Jesus. But there's a little bit more to it than that, and I wanted to hand it over to Josh to explain exactly what is going on with Aslan and his relationship to Jesus.
Yeah, so a lot of people think initially, for our mom, for example, when she read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it totally spaced on her that there was any symbolism to Christianity. The second level to understanding the Chronicles of Narnia is like, oh yeah, this is a direct metaphor for the life of Jesus and Christian principles, which is closer to what Lewis meant, but the closest we can get to discerning it, we can find from the letters of C.S. Lewis. And Lewis writes, if Aslan represented the immaterial deity in the same way in which the giant despair represents despair, he would be an allegorical figure. In reality, however, he is an invention giving an imaginary answer to the question, what might Christ become like if there really were a world like Narnia? And he chose to be incarnate and die and rise again in that world, as he actually has done in ours. This is not an allegory at all. And we also see this playing out in the story itself, not just in his letters afterwards, when the children at the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader are like, how can we live never meeting you? And Aslan says, but you shall meet me, dear one. So Edmund says, are you there too? Referring to where they're from, England. And Aslan says, I am. But there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there. Now, why is all this important? Because if we view Aslan as just a metaphorical character, it's just a fantasy story, and it's just another way of conveying the gospel story. However, when we realize that Aslan is Jesus, and Lewis is guessing at what might he be doing in another world, now we've transitioned from fantasy storytellers to theologians, because this is what theologians do. They wonder what God would want us to do in a given circumstance. And so Lewis imagines a big world, and we're talking about what God would do, what God would want us to do. And so that's why the Chronicles of Narnia are not fantasy, they're theological books, and they can really help guide in on a lot of the issues that you resonate with characters with in the books. Any thoughts on that, Gabe?
Yeah, so it really sounds like more than just like a one-to-one correlation between Narnia and the real world. It's almost like Narnia's maybe an expansion pack or a further exploration of God or a further exploration of these biblical concepts that we are already introduced to, just set in what happens to be a fictional setting. Is that fair at all?
Yeah, dude, I think expansion pack is the best way of putting it like that.
Sure, sure, sure. Cool. So let's talk about how the life of Jesus plays out in the world of Narnia. Because as Josh just said, it's not just Lewis is going to create this fictional character that's going to have these one-to-one correlations, but rather the story of Jesus is going to play out in this other world. It's going to look different, but because it's still Jesus, the same ideas are going to happen because it's the same person, even if it's figurative. And so how this plays out is you have the four children who enter into Narnia, and one of them betrays the others to the White Witch and becomes slave to her. And the White Witch wants to put Edmund to death in order to stop the prophecy from coming true, which would end her reign. So Aslan says, "Kill me instead." And so he gives himself up to the witch. He is beaten and mocked and cruelly dragged upon this altar, and then is killed on the altar. And then in the morning, he rises from the dead, just like Jesus also gives himself for the life of the world. And Jesus was also betrayed by Judas, of course. Another really important, I think, piece to this puzzle is that Jesus famously is surrounded by women at the cross. He only has one male disciple make it that far, and it is the women, Susan and Lucy, that are attending to Aslan during this whole experience, both watching his death and also attending to his dead body.
I think a way that would help us understand this passion of Aslan slash Christ is to not so much say Aslan is Jesus as to say Aslan is the second person of the Trinity or Aslan is the Son of God. Because when the Son of God comes, he comes in the human form, and Angel Gabriel says, "Name him Jesus." But there's a lot of typologies that indicate Jesus also came in the Old Testament, but didn't go by Jesus. And so when the second person of the Trinity comes to Narnia, he decides to, instead of form of a man, form of a lion. Instead of go by Jesus, go by Aslan. Interesting thought.
And the animals in Aslan find that offensive later on. The idea that a being so majestic and legendary as Aslan could have flesh and blood just like any other animal.
Hmm.
And I think that's offensive to people as well. Like you're gonna say that the Son of God came and took on this gross flesh and form, but that is the truth of the gospel and what it's saying. Aslan also has a father. Like that is canon within the lore. He's not like this simplistic deity. Um,
The great emperor over the sea.
you got the great
Yeah.
emperor over the sea. Exactly, yeah. And then probably my favorite under talked about aspect of the whole sacrifice of Aslan is the fact that the stone table cannot be used afterwards. In the Bible, Jesus' sacrifice puts an end to all sacrifice. It's the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. The whole world has been atoned for. And even though in the story, it's only technically Edmund that Aslan is dying for, there can be no more deaths of traitors upon the stone table because it's broken. It's broken, it's destroyed. And that's what Christ's sacrifice does for us. There needs be no more death of either us or an animal on our behalf because Christ's atoning work is sufficient for all. And I think that's a really important aspect of Aslan's passion. All right, Aslan as divine being. Go for it, Josh.
Yeah, so this is a little bit more of an obvious one. You all probably noticed watching the movie or reading the book is that after the witch turns a ton of people to stone, Aslan brings them back to life, and the way he brings them back to life is he just breathes on them. And so the correlations to this are going to be first and most obviously in the story of Genesis, when God breathes life into Adam, and that's how he becomes alive. And then Jesus claims to be life itself when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me, which brings a deeper level of meaning to receiving communion because Christ claims to be in the Lord's Supper itself and also claims to be life itself. And so that's a way that we receive our very existence is through that.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that goes back all the way to the Garden of Eden, where life is given through this eating of this tree. And Jesus is then going to give us his very life and his body and blood. The bringing back to life of people that had been turned to stone, I'm not sure, but it calls to mind certain sort of throwaway. I don't know if you can call any verse in the Bible throwaway, but sort of blink and you'll miss it. Passages in the Bible, like in Matthew, where it says after the crucifixion of Jesus, some of the saints rise from the dead.
Oh, yeah,
I don't know if that's what this is trying to represent. It's also interesting that you have this initial battle, but there's also a battle to come. It's like the reign of Aslan has been set up through his emissaries, the four children, but there will be a final reckoning. And I think that that is very amillennial in its theology, that Christ comes and he sets up his church to rule on earth, but there is going to be a final battle. There is going to be a final reckoning. It doesn't mean that Aslan isn't reigning right now. It doesn't mean that Jesus isn't reigning right now, but there is a now and not yet component of that, if that makes any sense.
sure.
Change through pain.
I love this slide because it hits on something that Lewis wrote a whole book about this called The Problem of Pain. And it's supposedly, and I mean, probably pretty honestly, the oldest and most common objection to specifically Christianity, but broader the idea that if there's a God, how can he be good if pain exists? And so this story from the horse and his boy really helps to paint that picture. So the context is that Shasta was riding along on his horse, and a lion whose identity he doesn't know. We as readers don't know. We hear it's a lion and we think it could be Aslan, but then this lion smacks him while he's riding the horse and he falls and he like really hurts himself. And we wonder, well, maybe it's not Aslan because Aslan wouldn't just hurt Shasta. And so this quote comes from the end of the book, and we're finding out Aslan is talking to Shasta, our protagonist, and revealing some things. Aslan says, I was the lion. And as Shasta gasped with open mouth and said nothing, the voice continued. I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses new strength of fear for the last mile, so that you should reach King Loon in time. I was the lion who you do not remember who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so that it came to shore where a man sat, wakeful in midnight to receive you, the horse and his boy. So Aslan is revealing that he was behind all of these things, and the things, one, that caused Shasta pain at the time, ultimately worked for a greater good. And so let's contrast this with the first instances of pain we see in Scripture. This is shortly after Adam and Eve eat the fruit they weren't supposed to. God says to Eve, in pain you shall bring forth children. To Adam, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. And so the correlation here is that when Gabriel and I, specifically I, when I got mad at Gabriel growing up, I would just, or I would roughhouse him. I'd inflict pain on him because I was angry at him. And Gabriel was either accidentally or intentionally brilliant because he wouldn't roughhouse me back, making me
Or I was
more
just an imp.
frustrated. I don't know that. So the reason God gives us pain is because he wants being apart from God to be painful. Because he wants being with him to be the good thing. That's why it has to be pain, right? And that's why
Pain
it's
is
so,
inflicted as a pushing back to the light.
yes.
Because otherwise you'd be comfortable in the darkness. And the dark
Yes.
all while it might seem nice in the beginning, is awful in the end. So by making it a little bit uncomfortable, you're like, maybe I should move.
Precisely. Could not have said it better. And so it's fascinating that pain is the first thing God does. It's the first thing he does to bring Adam and Eve back to him. That's why this instrument exists. So that's pain for you.
That's awesome. I love that. Let's get into some characters here. So the big antithesis of Aslan in this world is Jadis the White Witch. And there's lots to be said about her, but I think the most important thing is that yes, she represents the devil, but just as the devil is not sort of this equal and opposite power to God as you do see in some Eastern religions, she is not an equal and opposite power to Aslan. She is not eternal like Aslan is. She is a created being, no matter what her backstory is. And the devil is also a created being. He is scary, he's big, he's powerful, but he's absolutely insurmountable when compared to the majesty of God. And while he's allowed to have a reign on earth and do damage, just as the White Witch is, ultimately, even she is subject to Aslan, whether she likes it or not. In the books, we have two different backstories that are given of Jadis the White Witch. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's said that she is the offspring of Lilith, who is a mythical person who was the first wife of Adam. No mention to her in scripture at all, but Lewis kind of takes this folklore and works it into his own story, and also probably also some Genesis 6 stuff. So she is a giant and not the good type. There are giants in Lewis's Legendarium, but I don't think she's that kind of giant, and I'll get into why I believe that in a moment. The big point of the Lilith backstory is to show that she is not the rightful Queen of Narnia, because as I believe Mr. Beaver says, Narnia, no, it was in Prince Caspian. One of the characters say Narnia was never right unless there was a son of man ruling on the throne. And that is very much in line with biblical theology that man is set to have dominion over everything else. That every single thing on earth has its function, and man is supposed to be the kings, and we're supposed to rule wisely and effectively on God's behalf. And the fact that we don't is one of the things that Jesus has to come and fix. The other backstory for Jadis is that she is the sole survivor of Charn. And to make a very long story short, in Lewis's Legendarium, Narnia and our world are not the only alternate realities that exist. There's innumerable alternate realities that you could go to. But the only three we ever learn anything about is ours, Narnia, and Charn. And on Charn, Jadis was the last queen, where she discovered and used what's called the deplorable word. We don't know what that word is, but it basically causes the destruction of her home world. And then she is awakened from an enchanted sleep shortly before that world is destroyed by Diggory, who ends up becoming the old professor that owns the wardrobe that the children go into. And what we know about her race is that they were a people much taller than the people of our world. When we look at these two backstories, on the surface, they do seem very contradictory, and Lewis, in my knowledge, makes no effort to synthesize them. Maybe there's something you know that I don't, Josh. But I do have a headcanon as to how these two synthesize, because I don't think that they're necessarily opposed to each other. My headcanon is that in Lewis's sort of fantastical version of our world, Lilith exists. She is a very evil person. She becomes the surmother of this evil race of giants, and that some of these giants ended up being transported to Charn, similar to how the Telmarines were transported from our world to Narnia. And they take over the world, initially having very good intentions and building massive cities and amazing infrastructure and art and music and all this stuff. And over time, pride and arrogance and gluttony and power hungriness starts to take over, and the kings get worse and worse and worse, finally ending in Jadis, who is an offspring of Lilith and of the race of the giants, but through this sort of remedial route through Charn. I don't think Lewis actually confirms any of this, but that's sort of my headcanon. I don't know if you would what your thoughts are on that.
I have less thoughts on the character because I think just from hearing you, it tells me you know a lot more about the White Witch than I do.
I'm just insufferable. That's my point.
I the connection I'd want to draw, however, is that she's in some senses analogous to a Satan kind of character. And all of that backstory you just elaborated upon really helps us to understand who Satan is. So we sometimes, maybe a little bit theologically immature Christians, and that's not an insult, everyone's been there and we're still there technically, think that Satan is the opposite of God. But going back to a few slides ago, God claims to be life itself. So the opposite of life is non-life, non-existence. And Satan exists. So Satan isn't the opposite of God. I remember one of my pastors giving me an analogy that really clicked in my head. Well, he said it's probably not a perfect analogy, but a more accurate analogy would be that Satan is like the opposite of the Archangel Michael, something like that. And so that's kind of the sense we get from the witch. She's not this on par with Aslan, equally evil power by no means.
Yeah, she is on par with other powerful created beings, but evil.
Which is also important because we should really throw out all this mumbo jumbo. I'm great, I can do it, I'm strong, I'm powerful modern crap because scripturally none of that's true. God is much more powerful than you, and so is Satan.
Yeah,
And you can't overthrow him, which is just more reason to throw all your hope behind Jesus.
right. Only. Yeah, that's the thing is that the children don't kill the White Witch.
Yeah,
You know
yeah.
that the prophecy of her reign ending is fulfilled before their butts go on the thrones in Kaer Caravel.
Great
It's not
point.
that prophecy was wrong, but it's almost like Aslan fulfilled it in a very specific order to convey a very specific meaning.
Which again sounds like the Old Testament prophecies. It's like, oh yeah, Jesus totally fulfills all this, just not in the way I would have guessed had I just guessed based on the prophecies.
Absolutely. I guess the only thing I would say in closing about Jadis is that she is a foreign entity. She doesn't belong in Narnia, just as evil doesn't belong in our world. Neither does death, at least for humans.
Nice.
Okay, now let's get to the four children. This is probably my favorite character. Don't judge me. Lucy the Valiant. She's awesome. And what I think Lucy represents in the Chronicles of Narnia is the faith of a child. She is the first one to enter Narnia. She accepts it all as true. She's constantly going to her siblings and saying, "Hey, you got to come see this amazing world." There was this moment in Acts where Peter escapes from prison and he goes and finds his fellow Christians and he knocks on the door and there's this young girl that meets him at the door and she's like, "Peter!" And so she runs back and tries to tell everybody else and they're like sleeping. And they're like, "What are you talking about? Peter's in prison. Go back to sleep." Like you're making this up. She's like, "No, really, really, Peter's at the door. I'm serious, right?" And this is what Lucy is constantly doing for the siblings is like, "No, really, I saw Aslan. No, really, he's here." Because a child is willing to hear something and be like, "Okay, okay." And Jesus has this line where he says, "I want you to be as innocent as doves, but as poised as snakes or something like that, as wise as serpents." And there is, on one hand, we need to have like this totally innocent faith that's willing to accept, but there's also maturity that is discerning. So there's two sides of that coin, and I think she's meant to represent the side of the coin that's just totally willing to be like, "Yes, Aslan, I believe." Thoughts about Lucy?
I don't think so.
Okay, cool.
Oh, I like it.
Edmund, we have lots to talk about here.
Hmm.
So Edmund is the one on whose behalf Aslan goes to die, and I want to talk about his temptation because I think there's so much to unpack here. When he's tempted by the witch, what she wants is for him to turn over the rest of his siblings because she knows she can kill him, but she would rather have them all. And so she offers him a series of gifts. You have the promise of never ending supply of food and drink, and then you have the big one, which is you shall sit on my throne one day. Now, she knows full well that she's immortal because she ate that apple back in the first book, which is a whole nother story. But she's going to promise it to him anyway, and your siblings will be your servants. And what's interesting about that is that the only things that she has or can think of in the moment to tempt him with are the things that were already going to be his. I'll give you a throne. He was going to be a king anyway. I'll give you food. He was going to have infinite food anyway. And that is really quite a lot like what happens in the garden. The serpent says to Eve, "Eat this fruit and you will be like God." Oh, eat, by the way, tempting with food. Eat and you will become like God. But she's already like God. She was made in the image and likeness of God. It's like the devil just can't think of, he's very unoriginal. He has no original thoughts. He can't think of anything to offer us other than that which is ours already. You can have dominion. Well, you're already given dominion because you're a human being. You can have power and wealth and glory and immortality. These are already ours. And the definition of maturity is, can you wait for it? Edmund, can you wait just 5 minutes before you can sit on your throne? Apparently not. And then we have what I like to call the anti-Eucharist within the temptation. And there's I haven't seen anyone else talk about this. And that is I I don't think it's an accident that Edmund is tempted with bite-sized pieces of food and a chalice. I don't think that's an accident. Just to look at the timeline of events in our world in which this story is set, in January 1940, the British government does this food rationing thing where they ration foods, especially sugar. And so kids in Britain starting in 1940, they're not getting sweets because this is not allowed. And then as the Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe book begins, we're told that the kids are sent to the country in response to the air raids. Now that could refer to quite a few different things, but in my guess is most likely this refers to the Blitz, which begins late in 1940. So the sort of backstory of these kids is that they haven't had sugar in forever, and there's this big bad war going around them that they don't understand. Uh, they should be in school right now, so their lives are completely interrupted. And here comes this witch saying, eat of my food, drink of my drink, which I think is very proverbial because in the Proverbs you have Lady Wisdom who says, "Come eat of the wine I have mixed," and Lady Folly says, "Stolen bread is sweet." And I think this temptation with food motif just runs throughout the entire Bible. And I think there's more to it than we sometimes give credit to. Your thoughts?
I have a broader thought on Edmund, but I want to wait till your last Edmund slide
Sure.
on that.
What value do we place on the lives of others? Because in the story of Edmund, the value, how much worth does his siblings have to him? The answer, whatever a pile of snacks is worth. That's how much his family is worth to him. Conversely, what is the value that Aslan places on the life of Edmund? And the answer is his own life. And that flipping of the script is, I think, essential to understanding both the character of Edmund and the character of Aslan. Edmund's counterpart in the Gospels, Judas Iscariot, he betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And I think a lot of times we just have no idea what that really means. It's not nothing. I mean, silver is valuable, but it's not as much as you would think. 30 pieces of silver is mentioned three times in the Bible. Once as how much is owed when a slave dies due to an accident or negligence. Second, in Zechariah, where it's symbolic for how much the value people place on God, which is to say, next to nothing. And then in the New Testament, where Jesus betrays the Son of God for effectively next to nothing. And so, what we as human beings value our own God in is often petty change. Whereas what God values our lives in is the holy and precious blood of his only begotten Son. That contrast is the great exchange that I believe that Lewis was definitely very much a believer in. Part of Edmund's character arc is his ability to have mercy on others. He's very harsh to his siblings at first, and we see him as an adult ruling Narnia in the book The Horse and His Boy, and there's this prince that comes up against Narnia and tries to take it by force, and he loses horrifically. But Edmund, knowing he has every right to execute this person, chooses to have mercy on him because he himself has had mercy given to him. And that's a big part of even the Lord's Prayer, forgive us as we have forgiven those who have sinned against us. And it's actually Aslan who ends up punishing this person and turning him into the ass unless he stays within 10 miles of the temple or it's a long and very complicated story, but there is a character arc with Edmund. It's not his journey doesn't end with this sort of substitutionary atonement that Aslan does for him. It actually changes who he is as a person. I think it's a big misunderstanding of the cross. It's like, well, what did Jesus really accomplish? It's like, well, if you really believe this, it changes who you are as a person. It changes how you live. It changes how you treat other people. And we see that with Edmund.
The thing that I like about Edmund is he's one of the most important characters in the story, and the reason is this, is that if I asked you, Gabriel, to picture in your mind 1 billion Ferraris, what would you wouldn't even have a place to start, right? And if I asked you, Gabriel, can you picture infinity? Can you picture every person that's ever lived? I'm asking you to do things that you can't comprehend. And so in a lot of senses, the story of Aslan sacrificing his own life for Edmund is a much easier way of comprehending and a much more compelling way emotionally of understanding the sacrifice of the Son of God. Because when we hear that Christ's sacrifice was to save the whole world from all sin, we can't grasp that visually. But what we can grasp is how much of a butthole Edmund is. He sucks, right? And every time I watch the movie or read the book, I'm just frustrated by him and just awe-inspired by how Aslan, this perfect creature, would sacrifice his own life for such
Weasel.
a turd. And then it hits you. I'm the turd. I'm the turd that God gave his life for.
Okay, then we come to Susan. And for Susan, we need to do a little bit of looking forward to the end of the story. So if you are not familiar with how the Chronicles of Narnia ends, this is your warning that there are spoilers coming up and some pretty sad stuff as well at that. So if you want to read that first, do that. This is your warning. So let's talk about the resurrection, the new life after death as it exists within Narnia and our world. Josh hit it.
So the last battle is something of an ominous, slightly terrifying book, but with a light at the end of the tunnel. And so in the story, Narnia goes to crap and everything's going downhill, and Aslan starts to just make a new Narnia. And so this quote comes from the end. Why? Exclaimed Peter. It's England, and that's the house itself. Professor Kirk's old home in the country where all our adventures began. I thought that house had been destroyed, said Edmund. So it was, said the fawn. But you are now looking at the England within England, the real England, just as this is the real Narnia. And in that inner England, no good thing is destroyed. I really like the real England part, right? Because this is analogous, or I don't know if analogous is necessarily the right word, but it corresponds to Revelation when John says, And then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And it's that God is restoring in the end things to how they ought to be. And what they ought to be is the real way. And so when Aslan recreates the new world, the new heavens and the new earth, it's the same thing, just better. It's England. We recognize all that's good, and there's plenty of good things all around us. Heaven is, and we don't get this picture of the new earth being just singing harps and stuff. No, it's all the good things with all the bad things taken out. And there's nothing wrong inherently with England or Texas or Idaho. It's just made better. This is what makes this so deep is that we were never supposed to sin and want to ditch this earth, which is why we get a new earth. It's just as good to live in the moment. Now, why is this important? I just finished reading the holy book of the second biggest religion on the planet, Islam. And how do they explain what our existence is about? While the scriptures explain it to be where our home originally was, but fallen, Islam describes this earth as the exact words are a game and a distraction.
Mhm.
How hollow is that
Yeah.
compared to this?
Your life is a game and a distraction. It's meaningless in the and scheme of things.
I can't think of a more depressing thought.
That's all. I totally agree with that, and it's wild that you've read the entire Quran, by the way. But this is this is C.S. Lewis's eschatology, his theology of the end times, that the Christian the Christian approach to eschatology is not one of escapism, but one of restorationism, if that makes any sense. It's not just Islam that has this message of the whole purpose of life on earth, if it has any at all, is to escape it and to ascend to the higher spiritual reality that exists beyond it. It's like we were meant to have flesh and blood. We were meant to have things like jobs and houses and all of these things that keep us like these are all good. And the point, like the first thing God gave Adam in the garden was a job. He was a gardener, you know? So it's like to have these lives is beautiful. The problem is that they're corrupted and selfish and driven by sin. And so you need a restored earth, not a just totally doing away with the whole premise in the first place. And I think that's what C.S. Lewis's theology is, and I would totally agree.
Yeah, for sure.
So then we get to the big spoiler, which is Susan apostatizes at the end of the story. She does not make it to the real Narnia with the rest of the children. And this kind of blindsides you if you don't see it coming. It blindsided me. But the breadcrumbs really are there the whole time. Of the four children, she's always the most reluctant to do anything. She's the most reluctant to come into Narnia. She's the most reluctant to leave. She is sort of set up as the antithesis to the childlike faith of Lucy, especially within Prince Caspian, where Lucy will be like, "Oh, look, I saw Aslan," or "Look, we need to go this way. Look, we need to trust Aslan." Susan is, "You're just acting like a child. You need to be sensible. You need to be logical about this." Um, and not that these things are bad, but she is choosing these things over faith and over trust. And one of the lore drops that we get within the books is that after you leave Narnia, you don't remember it in the same way you remember what you had for lunch yesterday, assuming you had lunch yesterday. It's more like a dream. You remember it almost as if it was a dream. And so there's still an element of faith required to believe that it really was real. And so it's really easy to sort of rag on Susan and say, well, how could you possibly deny that Narnia was real? You went there twice, the first time for several years. Well, because for her it's a dream, and there is a little bit of effort that needs to be put in to live out the consequences of believing that's real. And for the other children, one of the consequences of continuing to believe that is that Susan chooses to distance herself from them as the story goes on. So the children have to believe, do I want to accommodate my sister and say, yeah, it was a dream, it was a fairy tale? Or do I stick with what I know to and believe to be true? And the consequence of that is that I don't have as much of a relationship with my sister as I'd like to. That's a really hard decision to make, but it's the decision they end up going with. And and I wanted to hear your thoughts as well on just denying the miraculous in general as something that humans can and do.
I think there's a really strong correlation between this character of Susan and what Lewis writes in Mere Christianity when he writes on the topic of faith. And what he writes about it isn't necessarily about strictly what it etymologically or scripturally pertains to, but more of how it daily applies to his life. And the way he describes it is, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the direct quote, is something like, when I was an atheist, sometimes I felt that Christianity was very plausible. And now that I'm a Christian, I have times where I think atheism is sometimes plausible. And so the role that faith played in his life was from keeping him from daily swinging back and forth and trusting that even though he doesn't have the same feeling of when he converted the first time, by the way, his conversion was incredibly mysterious. As he says, he can't exactly explain how, but he can tell you when. He was on a car ride to the zoo, and on the way there, he didn't believe Christ was the Son of God, and on the way back, he did. And faith kept him from swinging back and forth. And so it's very easy to play the skeptic in your life. It's very easy because we live in a universe where nothing is 100% certain. So we can always go to that 1% chance it wasn't true. It's very easy to say, no, 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 I don't believe anything. But that ultimately, if you don't believe anything with certainty, leads to relativism, which leads to moral relativism, which leads to self-contradiction, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and it's very easy to fool ourselves into thinking, well, if God just appeared in front of me in all his glory and majesty and said, "You man, I exist," well, then I would believe in him. But if we're really honest with ourselves, we would probably just tell ourselves that we were dreaming and that we were hallucinating or something like that. There's always, if you want to believe something is true or not true bad enough, you can make it make sense in your head. You can work hard enough to reason why something can't be true if you really really work hard enough. That actually happens with the magician in The Magician's Nephew. He refuses to believe that the sounds coming out of these animals are real words, and so he spends all this time just convincing himself animals can't talk, animals can't talk, animals can't talk until he can't hear them talk anymore, and all he hears is growls. And the rest of his time in the book is spent in just utter misery because he's worked himself out of believing the thing that he is seeing and experiencing because he just refuses to accept it.
I think for a long time I tried to think about why God would make a universe in which we can know nothing with 100% certainty. But I think it ties in with the relational aspect of our religion, and in perfect Christianity, those are non-contradictory and in perfect harmony. But it's that if we view God in a sense of a relational aspect, it would suck if you were forced. If it was if God didn't let you leave.
That would be an abusive relationship.
Exactly. And so he's gonna say, "All right, I'll let you leave." And I think that sucks, and that viewers I recommend not doing that.
Right. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences, but he'll if that's what you really want, he'll let you do it. The final character to just sort of round out our discussion of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is Peter. Magnificent. And for such an important character, there's not too much to say about him. He goes through his character arc in the first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that C.S. Lewis publishes. He embodies what it means to be a mature Christian and to stand up for what's right and to be a leader. It is probably no accident that his name is Peter, because among the four children, he serves as the first among equals among the children. He's not above them in rule, but he does hold this place as the firstborn, where he's a leader. As you go throughout the books, whenever his name is invoked, it sort of is a callback to the glory days of Narnia. It's like you don't even necessarily need to say anything specific about those days. You just have to say the days of Peter the High King, and everyone's like, "Oh yeah, those days, those were great." Right?
Yeah.
His gifts that he's given are the sword and the shield. And in the Bible, the sword of the Spirit is meant to represent the Word of God, and the shield is meant to represent faith. And so he's a warrior. There's more to Christianity than just sort of being a floppy, oh, I believe, but I'm not going to actually live out what I believe. It's like, being called to this office of being a Christian has consequences, and it means you're involved in a war. And oftentimes you're on the front lines of that war, and people are counting on you. And the laborers are few, though the harvest is aplenty. So, thoughts about Peter?
Yeah, I think just going through this with you made me think of a thought, and is that Peter doesn't have a dramatic story in terms of he doesn't go through like a Lucy situation, like why doesn't everyone believe me, or an Edmund story where he sucks and Aslan redeems him. He doesn't go through a Susan story where she becomes the apostate. He's just relatively good the whole way through. And it reminds me that that relatively uninteresting story is still completely central to the story. Peter's irreplaceable and he's foremost in these things. And it makes me think about a quote I heard from David Wood, who is a Christian apologist nowadays, who was an atheist and a relativist growing up, who beat his dad with a hammer and almost murdered him, went to prison, and became a Christian in jail. wow, what an elaborate story. And then he says to someone who was talking to him, he said, this person said to David, he said, I don't really have a testimony. I just grew up with good Christian parents and I've been a Christian my whole life. And David says that's the most beautiful testimony that you could have. That's much better. And so not having an elaborate story makes you no less important to the broader story.
Yeah, I would say like most of the people like my age that I'm friends or acquaintances with that are Christians have crazy stories where they grew up atheist or some like wacko cult or something like this. And I'll tell them like my story is boring. You know, I became a Christian on June 3rd, whatever, 2001, when I was baptized in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and I, I've had my ups and downs ever since. And what I've been told consistently is, I wish that was my story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I
Same story for me, but February 9th, 2003.
yeah, there you go, there you go. Yeah. Beautiful stuff. Beautiful stuff. All right. Well, thank you, Josh, for coming on the channel today. Any concluding thoughts before we get out of here and close super awkwardly?
Well, my always awkward outro is I just quote the words. I can't quote Jesus in my eyes like that. At the end of my
I am the
video,
resurrection and the life. Whoever
that's really
believes in
creepy.
me.
Yeah, we gotta say it more normally. I just quote Jesus in the Great Commission when he says that Jesus is with you wherever you go to the end of the age. That's what I always leave my folks with.
Amen. God bless. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye.